Hello, class. Good day. Today we'll be having our discussion on Rizal in London and the propaganda movement. I hope you had a great Christmas break, and I'd like to greet you a Happy New Year. We only have a few weeks left for the semester. We only have around 3 more weeks before the finals exam. So this is part of the series of lectures, probably 3 more videos before we end the semester. So let's begin. One of Rizal's intents in going to London was to find a book entitled Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas, or Events in the Philippine Islands. The book was originally written by Antonio de Morga, Lieutenant Governor of the Philippines during the latter half of the 16th century. Morga wrote the book since he wanted to save face from the incident that occurred during the Dutch invasion of Manila. Morga was the head of the Spanish Armada, or the Spanish fleet, when the Dutch invaded the Philippines. The Spaniards eventually won, but Morga's reputation was damaged, as accounts would state that he was just hiding in his cabin and eventually leaving his men by abandoning ship in the middle of the battle. Suffice it to say, what Rizal wanted to do was to make historical annotations of the original book. His main intent, however, was to write Philippine history from the viewpoint of the Filipinos. Now, there are many books on Philippine history, but why did Rizal decide to choose the Morga? Now, according to Umberto Campo, there were 5 reasons why Rizal chose the Morga. The first reason was that it was rare. The book can only be found in a few libraries in Europe. One of those libraries was the London Museum, found in London, Great Britain. So it was rare. Secondly, it was objective. It was not subjective. Now, according to Umberto Campo, the Morga was not like the works of the friars in Philippine history. The Morga was practically more objective compared to the other works in Philippine history. Thus, that was one of the reasons why Rizal chose it. The third one is that it was more sympathetic to the Indios. More sympathetic to the Indios. The fourth one was that Morga was a layman, not a religious chronicler. Rizal had a bias against the friars because the friars wrote Philippine history in a very biased way. They wrote it focusing on the achievements of the church and not on, say, the culture of the Filipinos or what the Filipinos did, who they are, what they have become, etc. So Morga was a layman. He was not a religious chronicler. And the fifth was that Morga was not only an eyewitness, but also a major actor in the events of the Philippine Islands. A major actor, Morga was a major actor simply because he was a lieutenant governor during the latter half of the 16th century. So he played a vital role in the development of the colony. So Rizal decided to choose the Morga because he was not only an eyewitness, but also a major actor in the events of the Philippine Islands. So there were 5 reasons all in all. Let me repeat the 5 reasons why Rizal chose the Morga. First, it was rare. Second, it was objective. Third, it was sympathetic to the Indios. Fourth, Morga was a layman, not a religious chronicler. And fifth, Morga was not only an eyewitness, but also a major actor in the events of the Philippine Islands. So, after Rizal annotated the Morga, you know what Rizal did is he went to the London Museum. He wanted to borrow the book and bring it to his apartment, but he was not allowed to. So what he did then was the first thing that he did was he went to the London Museum when it opened in the morning and left when it closed in the afternoon. So it took him a week to copy the Morga word for word. He copied the entire book. There was no Xerox copy yet at that time or photocopy at that time. So what he did was he manually copied the book word for word for a week. I do not know if you have the patience of doing that, but he was able to do it. So it took him a week to copy the book. And after copying the book, he then made his annotations. Annotations would refer, or annotations mean that he made notes of it, footnotes, so to speak. So it was not really an original book per se. It was more or less like a commentary of Morga's book or an annotation of Morga's book. Hence the title, The Annotations of the Events in the Philippine Islands. So that's what Rizal did. Eventually, the book was published, but then it was not as popular as the Noli Me Tangere, simply because it was written in a very scholarly manner. Uh, the ordinary folks could not understand uh, the way that Rizal wrote the book or how he wrote the book. It was written in a very scholarly manner. Today, students would say it's nosebleed. It was a different book compared to the Noli Me Tangere. So that's the reason why it was not as popular as the Noli Me Tangere. But eventually he wrote another book entitled The El Filibusterismo, which was his third book. And we will discuss more about this later on. The propaganda movement was a group consisting primarily of ilustrados. Their main goal, it must be noted, was assimilation, for the Philippines to become a province of Spain. This was their main goal, as it would indubitably follow that when the Philippines becomes a province of Spain, the Filipinos would then enjoy the same rights as Spaniards, as the former would become Spanish citizens. Equality, therefore, would finally be achieved. Another goal of the propaganda movement, given the limited participation of Filipinos in governance, was the Filipino representation in the Spanish Cortes. Now, the main leaders of the propaganda movement were Jose Rizal, Marcelo H. Del Pilar, and Graciano Lopez Haina. Rizal was the literary, Del Pilar was the lawyer, while Lopez Haina was the orator. They would eventually create a newspaper called the La Solidaridad, which was, by the way, also another name for the group. They established the La Solidaridad by December of 1888. Rizal became the honorary president of the group, and on February 1889, the first newspaper was published. Around the time the La Solidaridad was established, Rizal had heard the news about the destruction of Calamba, which he felt guilty about. He thought that he was responsible for the suffering that his family experienced under the hands of the Spanish colonial officers, not to mention the friars. Rizal also realized that the La Solidaridad was not successful in convincing the politicians of Spain in their advocacy, which was assimilation, equality, representation in the Spanish Cortes, and many more. Most of the politicians were conservatives and were against such policies. Lastly, there was also a split in the Madrid Filipino community as a result of the rivalry between Rizal and Del Pilar. There were practically two groups in the La Solidaridad, the Rizalistas and the Pilaristas. The Rizalistas consisted of the young members who were already advocating for a revolution as they believed that theirs was a lost cause. The Pilaristas were the old members, the old guards, if you will, of the group, who still were convinced that the Spaniards would grant them their wish of assimilation and equality. To make the long story short, Rizal ultimately left the group, leaving behind Del Pilar, who later on would try to settle their differences. Del Pilar wanted Rizal to return because they were losing support from the Rizalista Ilustrados, who also left the group after Rizal. So many other Ilustrados left the group after Rizal had left the La Solidaridad. Rizal, however, did not budge and simply wrote back to Del Pilar saying that scratches from a friend hurt more than wounds from an enemy. He then said, I have this defect. I forgive, but I forget with difficulty. Clearly, Rizal was hurt by the dispute between him and Del Pilar, and he did not want to return. He would later on say that he just wanted to bring the medicine nearer to the sick man. That's why he wanted to return back to the Philippines, because he wanted to fight the Spaniards in the Philippines, not in Spain anymore. The propaganda movement eventually failed for three reasons. Number one, members were not united as a result of petty jealousies. Number two, there was competition from another newspaper, the La Politica España en Filipinas. And lastly, number three, there was a lack of funds. There was a financial problem, so to speak. And this was the result of Rizal's departure from the La Solidaridad. Because when Rizal left, again, as I've mentioned a while ago, the other Rizalista Ilustrados also left with him. So the group started to lack funds and they needed money, but they couldn't get money. So eventually the group failed. So you must remember, class, that the propaganda movement did not succeed. Their goal was assimilation, their goal was equality between Filipinos and Spaniards, but it did not materialize because the Spaniards did not listen to them. No, the Spaniards did not listen to them. So the group eventually failed, and it was later on, the next group that Rizal created was the La Liga Filipina, and then eventually Bonifacio then created the Katipunan. And we will discuss more about this in our next discussion. So that will be all. Please take note of this lecture discussion, and I will be uploading two more lectures before we end the semester this year. Thank you for listening. Stay safe and God bless.